Okay, good morning, everyone. So welcome to the seminar. So we're going to start. So as usual, we are on the webinar mode. So people online, do not hesitate to report any technical issue in the chat. And please use the Q&A tab to ask your question. And we will allow you to interact with the room during the discussion session if you want to. And before we start, I just have a small announcement to make, which is that we just launched a new announcement for proposing speaker for next winter with a small specificity, which is that we are transitioning from LabX to this new PTL, whatever thing that is going to replace LabX soon. So we will have no money to offer to invite people. So we invite you to either invite people that are anyway coming or to suggest local colleagues for this specific call. So that's going to be a bit peculiar next winter, but that will be also interesting. And so with that, I thank very much for introducing Oscar today.
So hello everyone, and thank you for coming. So today we're welcoming Oscar Godoy from Sevilla. So Oscar's research aims at understanding species diversity and ecosystem functioning in general, and he's doing that by combining ecological theory with experimental and observational. So Oscar completed his PhD in 2009. Then he did several postdocs, including with Jonathan Levin and Eric Allen in Switzerland. And then he went back to Spain, to the University of Cadiz, where he was a research assistant and started to build his lab there. And he extended his work also from also terrestrial system and marine systems. And now he's working at the Spanish Research Council. Well, I will let Oscar tell us more about his work, and thank you for accepting the invitation.
Thank you, Claire. Thanks a lot. I think it's working. Donc, avant de commencer, je voudrais dire quelques mots en français. Il me fait plaisir d'être ici. Donc, merci pour Flore pour l'invitation. Merci à les organisateurs et merci aussi à Jean pour faire tout ça possible. Mon français, c'est pas très bien, donc je fais la présentation en anglais parce que sinon, il ne va fonctionner. Okay. So today I will like to, I know that there is a big mixture here between ecologies and evolutionary biologies. I will tackle more the ecological side because this is what I've been working most, but also I will try to make links, and perhaps this is something that we can do during the discussion, how to link these ecological ideas that I'm gonna propose to you with some evolutionary processes. And this is why the main reason I'm here working with Flore and also with Sarah, which is in the public. And I'm going to start from the very, very basics, and I will move to more complicated things, but I think it's really, really important to have like a very basic questions, and from this question just to spread. So I know that this question has been posed several times, but one thing that really motivates me is like why nature is so biodiverse, right? Why when you go to an annual grassland, or when you go to a coral reef or a tropical rainforest, you have so many different species. And you could say, well, it's nature, it's what it should be. But what will be the alternatives? I don't know whether you have read the book of Stanislaw Lem, Solaris, in which he imagined a world where there is only a single organism that dominates the whole world. Actually, it's an organism that looks like the ocean, and it can create complex structures and so on. It's a book that I really recommend. But why nature is between these two extremes? Indeed, not all the ecosystems are highly diverse. Not all the ecosystems have a single species. But why ecology, we study complex systems in which there are several species going in there, and they do complex behaviors. And then what I focus mostly is on species interactions. Species interactions can be competitive or facilitative. Here among plant species, we can have negative interactions with natural enemies, such as these fungi, or we can have positive interactions between pollinators and plants. These are photos I've been taking from my different field sites. And with this myriad of interactions, we think that really the maintenance of biodiversity is based on how species interact, how they establish these complex interactions, and how different processes emerge as an emerging property of ecosystem for the complexity of species interactions. And today I'm going to provide 3 examples, one based on community assembly, another example based on robustness to perturbations, and a third example of ecosystem functioning. So how species interactions promote the assembly of a community, how species interactions provide the range of perturbation systems can withstand, and also how the species interactions scale to provide emerging properties such as the production of the biomass, such as the functioning of the soil, and so on. Okay. And before I start to give particular examples, I think that it's really important not to go to the field and see what is going on, but also to have a background of which are your expectations. It's a bit dangerous because your expectations are going to change depending on the theoretical approach that you're taking. So if I'm taking certain theoretical approaches, my question will be more biased to some kind of techniques and therefore some outcomes. And if I'm using other approaches, then my questions will be biased towards all directions. So actually being a theoretician or having theory in mind is quite dangerous. So in this review with some colleagues, with Ignacy, Rudolf, and Sergey, I'm gonna provide you how we understand nature works, or at least how biodiversity is maintained in ecosystems. So let's start with the 2 simple case, which we have 2 species. How we see how biodiversity can be maintained is by the simple fact that species interact intra and interspecifically with different strengths. And that interactions, which are represented by these alphas, species 1 and species 2, create a domain that we call the feasibility domain. And this domain includes many different combinations by which species can grow, but still they can co-occur and coexist together and therefore persist in the long term. So the stronger are the intra versus interspecific interactions, which is something that was well known from classic theory, the larger is going to be this feasibility domain, and therefore the more opportunities are going to be in there within it. So species can differ in their intrinsic growth rates, but still they can be compatible with the long-term persistence. Okay? Why species can have different changes in intrinsic growth rates? Just because we have different environmental conditions. So if it's a wet place, one species will have higher intrinsic growth rate and therefore higher ability to produce offspring. If it's a dry place, will be the other species. So basically what we are incorporating here is environmental variation. If we go to more species, indeed, the opportunity for those species to coexist is going to change because we add more species. And when we add more species, it's not the interactions that between 2 species can be, it's also the indirect effect. And a common example is, imagine that you have 3 species, B will dominate over C, and therefore C will be excluded. But then, if we include the species A, just because A has a differential effect on B, which was the dominant, a very negligible effect on C, then the 3 species. So coexistence is due not to direct effect, but to indirect effect. How this translates to this theoretical idea of how coexistence works? Well, instead of having just 2 slopes and a given domain, it's a geometric approach that now we have a triangle, and the triangle incorporates the direct effects plus the indirect effects. Okay? So certain characteristics of the networks, such as more niche differentiation, and also a stronger effect of indirect effects, are going to enlarge this domain, and therefore are going to provide more opportunities for species to coexist. Okay. I'm not going to go behind the maths here, but I hope this idea was, despite theoretical, clear in how species can coexist. How we can translate that to, for instance, community assembly. And I'm going to present here the work led by David García Callejas, who has been a former postdoc at my lab. And now he's working with Jason Tilaniakis at New Zealand. And we ask a very simple question. It's like, in nature, there is a universal feature that is the species area relationship. As soon as we increase the area on a given area, of a given place, as soon as we have larger stands, we observe more diversity of species. At this distance to saturate, right? But all the literature that we know about species-area relationships come from a really phenomenological approach. So people go out, they see how many species are in a place, and they see how many species increase as we increase the area. Here we take, based on the species interactions, we take a completely different approach. And we say, can we obtain the same species-area relationship just by looking at how species interact? So the model that we are going to use will is not adapted to provide these curves. Rather, it will predict the species that are going to go to coexist based on the framework I said before. So can we obtain these curves? And also, if we can obtain these curves, the approach allows us to distinguish two things that are not clear in the literature. One is, when we have a species-area relationship, the idea was that environmental heterogeneity plays a huge role, because as soon as you increase the area, you have different environments, and with different environments, it dominates different species. But also we can think about how important is the contribution of environmental heterogeneity compared to the area on itself, right? Because if you have more area, it is also likely that you have other stochastic processes, such as dispersal, that can contribute also to the species-area relationships. So what we did, always our scientific approach is combining field data or observational data with population models or statistical models and theory. What we did we are working within Doñana National Park in these areas, which are annual grasslands, quite flat. They are flooded during winter, and this is why they are important for wintering birds and migration. We select 22 species. I'm not going to explain the details, but we measure pairwise interactions, so the alphas, the intra and the inters. We also measure the ability of species to grow, the species vital rates, which is a combination of seed production, germination, plus the survival of the seeds in the soil bank, which altogether makes the art that I was showing before. We combine that into a population model in which we include environmental heterogeneity, because we measure different areas within the large extent. And actually we predicted coexistence based on whether species can dominate, and different species dominate in different places, whether species are able to coexist in pair just by direct effect, or whether species are able to coexist in multiple coexistence just by the combination of direct effect plus indirect effect. And taking all together, we want to know whether we reach the species-area relationship normally observed in nature, regardless of the taxa that you are thinking about. Okay, so this is what we observe. We measured that for 5 different years. This is an increase in area, and this is an increase in the average number of species that either we predicted or we observed. What you can see here is that the green line, the richness, is the overall number of species that we observe in the community. So you go there, and across the 9 plots, which account for almost 700 meter squares, sometimes some years we observed up to 19 species, and other years, especially this one, we observed no more than 14 because it was a very rainy year and the area was completely flooded. What we observe is contrary to expectations, is that the blue line here, which only accounts for the spatial extent, so how much we increase the extent without increasing the environmental heterogeneity, it accounts for most of what we observe of the species-area relationship. The comparison of the blue line with respect to the yellow line, so how much add environmental heterogeneity to the increase in the species-area relationship, is very low. And that happened more or less for all the years. So if I see from 0 species, really the curve that goes up is the blue, the yellow one increase a bit, and then the comparison of the yellow and the blue one with the green one will tell you which species are present in the system, but they are not predicted to coexist. Most likely because they are transient species that they were into the system, because they provide propagals from elsewhere or things like that. So these results really show that bottom-up processes based on species interaction and how interactions occur in the spatial extent can be a mechanism to display a universal pattern of nature, which is the species-area relationships. We can also say, okay, the classic idea was like, accumulate more species because of the change in dominance through space. And what we observe is actually that this is not what we predict. The dominant case, which will be this light blue, is very rare across all these years. So what is really common is that the species are able to be accumulated through space because they're able to coexist in pairs. And the indirect effect also, which is the multi-species coexistence, does not play any role. So how we interpret these results? We interpret these results that diversity is accumulated in nature through space just because the space creates opportunities for pairs to encounter at different locations. And thanks to that, we accumulate richness. And it's not because a species establish complex interactions in the field or because there is a huge change in the dominant in the dominance of a species through environmental heterogeneity. Indeed, we also observe that there are many transient species across all year, which means that there is a pool that is there in the community because of deterministic processes, thought as species interactions, but there is another pool of species that are there just because of stochastic events. Again, could be sampling issues, could be stochasticity on dispersal, and other factors. Okay. I hope with the first example, I provide you evidence of how important are local species interactions for community assembly and patterns that we observe in nature. I'm going to jump into another issue, which I think is quite important, and we do not understand it yet quite well, is how resistance are ecosystem to perturbations. And you can think perturbation in many different ways. You can think perturbation as a strong perturbation. So for instance, there is a fire, there is an earthquake, there is a flooding event, or you can understand resistance to perturbation as small perturbations, like changes in climate, changes in soil conditions, things like they are slightly changed, but they still can have profound consequences for the ecosystems. In this work published last year, also led by Alfonso Allen Perkins, who was a postdoc also at my lab, we thought, okay, every time that we use the combination of theory, population models, and data, we try to gain a more mechanistic understanding of the effect of species interactions on how diversity is maintained. But sometimes we don't have too much predictability, like what we predict and what we observe, there's a lot of variation in there. And sometimes we say, well, it's because we don't account for all the factors, we should move to some other random forest approaches or other complex approaches in which we can handle statistically all this noise that can occur in nature. So is there a way to have both, to eliminate such trade-off, to say we can have models that they have mechanistic understanding, but also they allow us to predict what is going to be the future fate of the community. So how can we make predictions based on our present state of what is going to be the next state? What can we make predictions about how I have a given abundance of a species and what will be the next abundance? Which species are going to be extinct? Which species are going to increase the population? Is going to the ecosystem change to a completely different state? It's going to be something progressive. And for that, one thing that we need to acknowledge, and I'm going to explain this a bit more, is that interactions are not symmetric in nature. So right now, my interaction with you is not the same as your interaction with me. Such asymmetry is super common in nature. So the effect of a bee on a plant is completely different in terms of strength of the effect of the plant of the bee. Sometimes the plants depend much more on the bees than the bees depend on the plants, for some cases. For other cases, it's completely the opposite. How we can translate that to the theoretical background I was saying before. So when I was presenting the triangle, which again, I'm gonna say again the idea the triangle represents the opportunity for a species to coexist. So larger triangle represents more opportunities based on changes on their ability to grow. We will expect a triangle that is completely equilateral when all species interact alike, okay? But we know that this is not true. So what should be our common expectations? These triangles are not equilateral. They should be with other shape. And this shape is related to the strength and the asymmetry in the strength of the species interaction, okay? So what does it mean? It means that if we have a non-equilateral triangle, then we have some species that will face perturbation better than others. because that here inside represent the area in which the three species can coexist. But here outside represent an area in which only two or one species will be able to coexist. And the transition from the three species coexistence to the two or one species coexistence goes along these edges. So for instance, if you go along this edge, if you're in this position and you go along this edge, the thing that is going to happen, as it says, is that the species C is going to be excluded. And if you go into that direction, then the species A is what is going to be excluded. What is clear when you have a non-equilateral triangle is that the length of each side of the triangle is different. Some lengths are longer, and therefore they have more chances to be excluded, whether other lengths are shorter, and therefore it's more difficult for the system to go in this direction, and therefore that the species to be excluded. So interactions provide us a mechanistic understanding of how large are the domain for a species to coexist, but interactions also tell us which is the species that is most likely to be extincted in the community if the intrinsic growth rate of a species goes from coexistence to exclusion. And what we find, if we measure the exclusion ratio, which basically tells you, is it like a Pilou index of evenness? It tells you how equilateral is the triangle. 0 means completely equilateral, and higher values means non-equilateral. What you observe is that when you have more asymmetry in interactions, the triangles are going to be more changed. Sides, the length of the sides are going to be different, and the populations are going to decrease in their growth rate of a given point compared to the next one. So what it's telling you is that if you are here and you have a perturbation, if you're really at the center, which is really stable, and then you have a perturbation, if it is small or if it's large and goes in every direction, all species will be able to coexist, and the populations and their growth will be maintained. But if you are here and you have a large perturbation because you have a large change in climate, and you go in this direction, you are for species C and for species B, you are at the edge of exclusion. What happens when you are a species that are at the edge of exclusion? That you have lower growth, you will have a lower increase in population, therefore you will be at the edge of to be out from the system. And this is what we are observing. So when the triangle is very equilateral, the species have a wide variety of growth rates, but as soon as you make one side larger than the others, some species will be really affected, and therefore they will change their growth rate. And actually, this is the data that I was presenting for Doñana National Park. This is what we observe in the field, and actually for different sets of ranges of exclusion ratio, this is the observations and the predictions match to a large extent. Okay, so I hope I provide you insights about how the model can give us a mechanistic understanding, but also a predictive ability, and how we have break the trade-off. And the last piece that I would like to present today, and it's going to be a bit longer than the others, is about ecosystem functioning. This is a work I've been doing with Erika Lan and Caroline Daniel. We've been advising her PhD, and it's work that soon will be submitted, but I would like it to present here to have input from you. Okay, so one thing that we've been working on a lot is to understand the maintenance of biodiversity based on species interactions. There is a whole literature of how the species interactions connect with ecosystem functioning. The clear idea is that if intra is higher than inter, so a species limited themselves more than the others, they should be using unique resources that are not using the others, and that will produce complementarity effects. Because I'm using one resource, the other species is using another resource, then we don't bother each other, and both of us produce higher biomass compared to whether we'll be alone. That is the idea of complementarity effects. but at the same time, more recent literature is telling you that the relationship is not one-to-one, and there are other processes. What happens when you don't have two species, but you have complex sets of interactions, and you have direct effects, such as the one I was describing with complementarity, but you have also a lot of indirect effects. And with Caroline, using the idea of the triangles and the idea of the opportunities for species to coexist, we wanted to relate the whole field of community assembly with the whole field of ecosystem functioning. And the title is a bit provocative, so more stable communities deliver higher functioning, and I will explain what means more stable communities in the structuralist sense. And also I will explain a bit more what means not only a specific function, what people has already measured a lot, which is biomass, but also what means when you have several functions. When you compare biomass, also soil productivity, also resistance to pathogens, or pollinator services, and so on. So a few years ago already, we published this paper, not based on the structural stability, although the ideas were the same. And we found that for different environmental conditions, let's say an average climatic years, and also we simulated drought, we observed that when species limit themselves more than they limit others, so when we have larger opportunities for species to coexist, which here is called niche differences, but also when the species are far apart from being excluded, so fitness difference mean how better is one species over the other. So when the combination of both makes communities to be in the sweet spot of having a lot of niche differentiation, but being far apart from being coexistence to exclusion. So when you are around here, especially here as well, is where you have higher delivery of ecosystem functioning measured at in terms of biomass. Okay, why this is so? We believe this is so because, again, the complementarity arises from the niche differentiation, and if there are not too many fitness differences, so if one competitor is not higher than the other, it will not limit the presence of the other. If you have higher fitness differences, for instance, but still coexistence might occur a community that is really uneven. So one species account for the 99% of the biomass, and the other species will be only the other 1%. Okay. So again, we focused on the triangle, and we thought what we are measuring here basically is the distance to the edge, the distance of being a community that can coexist to a community that only one species dominates, right? So how we can measure the distance to the edge? We can measure the distance to the edge in the triangle approach of the interactions define the domain in which you can coexist, but the dot is your observed abilities to grow, your observed intrinsic growth rate. The farther you are from the edge, regardless of the direction, so the farther you are from here or the farther you are from there, we'll measure the distance to the edge, because here inside means coexistence and here outside means competitive exclusion. So if we are able to obtain species interactions, we can build the triangles. If we are able to measure intrinsic growth rates, we can know the position of the community. And actually, having these two things, we can do the maths and calculate the distances. Okay, but when we evaluate functioning, there are many things to evaluate. As I said, we can evaluate a single function, but we can evaluate also other things. Another thing that we can evaluate is the multifunctionality. So what happens when you have from one species to multiple species? But also you can evaluate the net effect of the multifunctionality. So what happens again when you have when you have one species over and multiple species, taking into account that some of the species can do several functions at the same time. So here are two extremes. In this case, there is a community in which we have three species, each one do a particular function, but we have a high multifunctionality when we combine the three, because we gain the specific function of each species, right? So this is a system in which we have a lot of multifunctionality, but the net effect is low, because although each species provides some functioning, For instance, these provide root biomass, these provide resistance to pathogens, and these provide other things. When we have the three of them combined, the overall level of function is low. So there is multifunctionality with, but low multifunctionality. In this case, it's the opposite around. We have high multifunctionality, but the net effect of the multifunctionality, the net effect of having a lot of species diversity in the system is low. Why so? Because there was already one species alone that could provide the whole multifunctionality that we observe in the system. So we need to separate the effect of multifunctionality for the net effect of biodiversity on multifunctionality. It's a bit complicated, but I think it's important to separate both effects. So what we did, and I like a lot this experiment, is that we were working at Pandif experiment. This is at Bern in Switzerland. And what we were doing, there's the typical ecosystem functioning experiment where they have different assemblages. For 12 species, we measure at this experiment the species interactions and the species vital rates to create the triangles and the distance to the edge. Then we use this information to inform a completely different experiment in which we selected triplets, so 3 species together, that they differ in their distance to the edge. So we manipulated having information from one experiment to inform other experiment in which we create an axis of distance to the edge. We evaluated the functioning, both the multifunctionality and the net effect. So it's a test. It's like, is the species interactions that I'm observing in one experiment context dependent of that experiment, or is the way species interact? And therefore, when I take this species out to another experiment, then I can provide and I can get in new information of the natural way species interact, not just because I have a given particular conditions. And what we found is that for both multifunctionality and for both the net effect, the minimum distance to the edge increases both the multifunctionality and both the net effect. So this is rather novel in the sense that if I have more stable communities, that they can resist more to perturbation, and if these communities are also more differentiated in the way they use resources, they increase both the multiple functionings that ecosystems have, but also they are boost the level that diversity has on this multifunctionality. The thing is that this multifunctionality, this is the minimum distance to exclusion, is not occurring, well, in this case, it's only for foliar pathogens, for fungi damage, for foliar pathogens. It's not occurring for an additive effect of all the functions. So what it's telling us is that there is not a particular function which is promoted by the minimum distance to exclusion. It's the combination of all functions. So here, what it's telling you is that it's not that biomass production is very high, it's not by root biomass is very high or herbivore damage is being high. Is that this multifunctionality emerges, or the positive effect of the distance of the stability in coexistence with respect to multifunctionality emerge as a combination of multiple functions at the same time. And this makes sense because species interactions, it does not occur for a particular process. Species interactions resume many of the things that are happening at the same time in nature. Therefore, we should expect only the multifunctionality occurring when we consider all functions at the same time and no particular functions. This is true what I was explaining for the raw effect, that is basically multifunctionality, or for the net effect as well, which is basically the contribution of multifunctionality of biodiversity compared to having single species. Okay, so these are 3 work that we've been doing lately, and I'm very proud of the people and also the outcomes. But we are traveling at the speed of light, or we are traveling at the speed of light, although we are not. But the thing is that where we are heading next, we have all this new knowledge, we have all these new tools. We want to go fast and to discover a lot of different things, but at the end is step by step where we are heading next. And would like to present you 2 different things just to end the talk. One is related to the non-equilibrium dynamics. This is work I've been doing, or I'm doing currently with Violeta. She's a postdoc at the lab. in which we have gathered information for 9 years of 2 contrasted systems here in South Spain, in Doñana National Park. One is for the annual plants, in which we have different plots located at different humidities, but also we have information of bees abundances at different forest patches that they vary in their size of the forest patch. And we have had, we've been lucky because since we started measuring in 2015 till last year, we have had a huge variation in precipitation. Some years were typical as average, while the last 3 years were super dry. So actually we can see whether the communities, as soon as you have a strong stressor, change to another state, or they are resistant to perturbations, and so on. How we are approaching to this? So far, what I have told you is about species are considered to interact in a given way. This is the way they interact, and this should be like that regardless of the time. But we thought, well, it has been quite a lot of precipitation in the last 9 years, so that should have an effect on how species grow, how species interact. And therefore, we are gonna think, or we are gonna assume that the interactions are not fixed anymore, but they are varying through time. And they are varying through time because actually precipitation is varying through time, okay? And this simple change in mind has 2 important consequences. One is that we move from an equilibrium point of view, so we move to the classical idea that coexistence is because the species reach an equilibrium and there's a stability there. So, you know, like the classical climax situation, to really a non-equilibrium dynamic, because every time conditions will change, interactions will change, and therefore the endpoints of the community will be different. Sometimes some species are favoring a dry year, other species are favoring a wet year, and so on. And also, when we think that the interactions are time varying, so far we've been focusing on, okay, there should be an effect of precipitation, but there should be an effect of many other different things. It's not the same what is going to happen in a wet year, in a dry year for a bee, if you are in a large patch in which you have a lot of flowers, compared if you are in a very, very small patch. So there is a lot of stochasticity on the change of species interactions through time. So how we incorporate this? And then is where things get a bit complex. So far, what I have told you about the structural stability and the triangle and the opportunities for species to coexist is based on the notion that we have a very simple framework, which is a locable terra framework, in which you have the intrinsic growth rates, you have the matrix of species interaction, and so on. As soon as you start adding variability, such as, for instance, precipitation influence intrinsic growth rates, and precipitation also influence the magnitude of the species interactions, the whole framework of structural stability does not work because you incur in nonlinearities. And I have to tell you that I've been speaking with a lot of mathematicians and physicists, and they don't know what to do. So this is, I think it's a nice example that sometimes ecology has been a lot of influenced by theory, and we have embraced this theory. But this is the point where ecologists, also empiricists, are telling theoreticians like, okay, you should account for that, how you're going to account for this, and they have no idea. Also, in this, this is basically, I have put it like that, but this is basically a generalized linear mixed model, so it's something that you can code easily in R. How we account for the deterministic would be interactions and precipitation, but also how you can account for randomness. Well, you can say that there is some unexplained variance, and that the explained variance is going to depend on the year and also in the precipitation. If the conditions are drier, yeah, at least for our systems, there is more variance to explain. But if the conditions are wetter, the unexplained variance is reduced. So statistical models and not theory, what I'm trying to say here is that statistical models and not theory are being able to account for things that we observe in nature, such as the change between the deterministic and the random part. For the annual plan model, what we observe through time, these are the 9 years, is a shift from competition to facilitation as the year gets drier. So, and this has been documented in a lot of studies and is coherent with the stress gradient hypothesis. So climate has a huge influence of changing the matrix of species interactions toward including less competitive interactions and towards including more facilitation. So that is nice because it's telling us that changes in species interactions are not random. There is a strong deterministic component, and at least in our system is determined by one environmental variable. So, sorry, and actually, sorry, one thing that I did not explain, and actually the changes are occurring, but they are not so big. So the magnitude of variation is pretty low. What is driving really changes in our system when we move to a time varying framework is changing in the intrinsic ability of a species to grow. And that makes sense, right? Sometimes when the conditions change a lot, it's not too much how species interact, it's also how I'm able to profit of the new environment. Whether I have the features, whether I have the traits that allow me to cope with the new conditions. Sometimes these new conditions could be favorable, other times could be detrimental. And this is what I'm presenting here for 3 species. So you have the intrinsic growth rate along years for 3 species, and the plot is what we consider random. So we measure interactions at different places, and we know that some plots, they have higher nutrient content and less salinity, others the other way around. And what we observe is that really the magnitude of the variation, so here the maximum variation was 0.4 points from minus 0.3 to 0.1. And here the magnitude of variation can be from minus 0.5 to almost 3. So really the variation is in the intrinsic growth rates. And the variation is not due to deterministic processes such as precipitation. It's based on whatever these guys encounter in natural conditions that is summarized at the plot level. And I think it's important because if we go back to the idea of the, sorry, I'm gonna go fast. So if we go to the idea here, again, the approach is no longer valid, but if we assume that this is valid, if we are here, what is telling us is that the triangle more or less remain the same. In communities, what will be occurring is that due to the strong variation in the intrinsic growth rate, they will move around here. And sometimes they will be excluding some species, they will be in. So basically the time varying framework is a framework to tell us how stability conditions change through time and how we can move from an equilibrium to non-equilibrium perspective. Okay, and the last point, but also highly important is why I'm here. So because we've been working a lot on natural systems, but on natural systems, the alphas of the interactions is done in a phenomenological way. We have a strength of interactions and we don't know why this is occurring, right? But actually we could tease apart. Species might compete for common resources such as space or food, but the species might incur in other types of competition. And one source of competition is reproductive interference. So when 2 species are together, they can produce hybrids, and that can lower the populations of the species, and that can have consequences for the persistence, right? So with Flora and Sarah, what we've been doing actually is seeing how these are, okay, I'm gonna explain this. These are our measure of fitness, a density. So basically what we are seeing here is how density-dependent effects affect your ability to grow when you are alone and when you are with an increasing number of neighbors. And this, you can see that there are differences when the species grow alone and when the species are exposed to a competitor. There are also differences in how reproductive interference occur when you are alone and when you are with other species. And we can see the combined effect of both of them. So basically what is telling all this variation is that it's not only important to account for competition for resources, that it might be occurring again by competing for space or for food, but it's also important to account for other sorts of competition that are related to sex differences and to reproductive interference. And actually why is important? Because when we have only food competition or reproductive interference, our predictions of which species are going to be able to coexist are limited. we can predict that in this case, one species exclude the other. Sometimes they are including in priority effects. For the reproductive interference, there is no coexistence, either one or the other wins. But when we include both, we can have additive and non-additive effects that can profoundly change the outcome of interactions and how we understand the stability of the network. Work despite competition for food or apparent competition when you share a common enemy or reproductive interference, despite there have been a huge literature in the last decades, it has been really independent, and combination of both are super rare, which is surprising, right? Because it was acknowledged a long time ago. And also what is very unique and rare here is that several people might have studied a few of them, but they have not been combined in a systematic way in which we can make predictions and actually test whether our predictions fit with observations. So it's not only saying it's important to account for reproductive interference. It is important to account for food competition. Well, tell me how it is important to account for. Tell me which are the predictions that you're going to have, and tell me whether your models actually fit these predictions when you do experiments and when you go to the field. So we are trying to produce here a more nuanced way of how to combine, again, data with experiments and with theory. Okay, so I think it's 45 minutes. I wrote this tonight, and perhaps I was a bit tired. So the question was at the beginning, like, why nature is so biodiverse? And I have provided you a lot of information, a lot of literature, a lot of ideas, and I have to say that I don't really know. We are still super far from understanding how nature is so biodiverse. But I think we keep on going, and I think we are making progress. And I think the idea of incorporating really explicitly species interactions, the interplay between species interactions, which is an internal factor of the community, with environmental forcing, like external factor, I think is important. I have not spoken at all about evolutionary processes, and you can think of many examples. You could be thinking that there should be evolutionary feedbacks when you have reproductive interference. You should be thinking that there should be adaptation of plants to new environment, and you can think about which is the speed of adaptation to new environment compared to how the environment changes itself. And depending on how fast goes each one, it will have contrasting effects. But I think we are in a very golden area of ecology right now, and the branches that can establish with evolutionary biology to better understand really complex systems and complex behaviors. Thank you.
Thank you, Oscar. So I don't know if people have questions in the room.
Thank you, Oscar. I just have a clarifying point. I was really interested in your results showing that interactions in community shift from more competitive to more facilitative along environmental data. I was wondering if you knew, like, underlying, do you have change in species composition, or is it the same pair of species?
So yeah, the set of species is fixed through time. And what we think is that when you have dry conditions, it's super dry, like it's very like a Mediterranean arid places. And also you have the effect of the salinity in the soil. So we think that we have not proved it yet, but the facilitation that occur within a species and also between species occur through increasing the better conditions in the soil, either through mycorrhiza or through amelioration in water uptake, because there is a lot of varieties in root system. So we believe some species with deeper systems, they bring water to the upper parts.
Thank you for the talk. Is there expectation that when the environment go back to a less broad system, the competition is gonna establish again?
Well, this is what we believe. We have established a linear relation. Well, it could be non-linear, but it doesn't make too much difference. There is a linear dependency of the strength of competition based on the variation in precipitation. So we find a strong signal that wetter years, they have more competitive interactions by the fact that in wetter years, individuals grow more. So they produce, so basically what happened is that here, imagine that this is a plant that is producing seed. When it's alone, it's huge and it produces a lot. But also the other individuals in the neighborhood are huge. And therefore the slope, which measures the strength of competition, is steeper compared to other cases. When you have dry conditions, individuals are very small, so competition is not so mediated by size. And therefore you don't produce too much seeds, but your neighbors are really small and they don't make any competition on you. So basically the line, instead of being like that, is more or less flat.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Maybe a question to try to link the first part of your talk where you show data in the field and the last one where you show data in little bottles. So how can we really connect, try to test theory using, I mean, maybe this is because I am also using these microcosms.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to test theory in these little cages because there's no dispersal, for example.
Yeah.
So do you think that in this kind of persistence, you really have like meta populations or meta communities?
Yeah.
And the persistence is basically driven by dispersal that we cannot see in this microcosm condition. Yeah,
this is a very good question, actually. I've been trying to wrap my mind about this question, and there are many things to say. So okay, let's go from, okay. So we've been playing with the local Volterra that we add dispersal, and dispersal as diffusion, which means that if you have two sites, one with a high population and another one with low population, there will be just dispersal because you go to an equilibrium in which the highest population goes to the lowest population, and then until they equilibrate. Okay? So when that happens, that does no longer work. What you have is some kind of nonlinearities that make something like that. So from the really beginning, the theoretical expectations are completely different if you include dispersal and non-dispersal, just because it changes the area in which species can coexist. That is one thing. Another thing is that for having dispersal, sorry, do I have a matrix here? Okay, I don't have a matrix here. For adding dispersal, how you treat dispersal compared to interactions. One thing that you could be doing is if you have a metapopulation approach, then your matrix is not a single matrix, you have a block matrices that what you have is the diagonal are interactions within each site, and the off diagonal are dispersal rates from one patch to another, which increase the complexity of how to measure that in the field, and also makes the assumption that dispersal should be equally important as interactions, which sometimes is not easy. What else? I've been thinking a lot of dispersal. Also, dispersal, indeed, we believe it is important because here there is a lot of transient species that they arrive because they have a viable population elsewhere. But then it also brings the question of, should I incorporate these other populations explicitly because the amount of the population size that they will have should be somehow related to the number of propagules I obtain. So I fully agree. It's super hard. And in experimental mesocosmos, I've been doing a lot of them with annual plants. My feeling is that you can perhaps test things such as it's more like mechanistic. It's more like how important is environmental variation for driving changes in the species interaction, how important are species interaction for driving ecosystem functioning. But when you go into predictions, it's much more complex. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. Related to this graph and this experiment, I was thinking whether you find so that the species area relationship were mostly driven by area, but do you think how specific is it from this system or can be generalized to other systems? Because I think that maybe this system is very specific in that case.
Fully agree. So the system is a bit homogeneous in terms of the environment. So perhaps the importance that we are giving here to the role of environmental heterogeneity is lower compared to other systems in which, I don't know, if you go to a savanna, you have a wider variety of environments. Yet I think the theory has been biased a lot towards the idea of incorporating environmental variation as a major driver of species-area relationship. And I think perhaps we are at the other extreme, but my feeling is that both spatial extent and environmental variability are equally important for the idea that the spatial extent can allow things to occur. So imagine that you have 10 species and they are not all predicted to coexist at the same place, but you have a subset of species that are predicted to coexist. So these 2 species, these other 3 species, a combination of 4. If you have a very, very small area, there will be no chances for all the combinations to occur. But if you have a huge area, it will be more chances for different subsets of stable species to occur at different locations.
Thanks.
No, it's right. Maybe I missed it. The second, or if you have multiple trophic levels, then does it change any of your expectation in the models?
Yeah. Again, a very nice question. No, for this case, the 19 species were all annual plants. We did not include any pollinators or herbivores or spiders, things like that. The problem with that is that if I go to the field and I need to look for the nest of the wild bees, it's a useless task. I mean, I cannot measure. So for these areas to emerge, we need, remember that we need information of the intrinsic growth rate of the species and all pairwise interactions, both intra and inter. So it really so far works for plants. One thing that we could be doing is having a long time series, inferring interactions and intrinsic growth rates for the time series, and then building this species area relationship based on that.
In one of the slides, you showed that diversity maximizes ecosystem functioning.
Yes.
And I was wondering whether this is a universal phenomenon or whether it depends on specific assumptions, and if the latter which I can.
No, I think well, that biodiversity enhance functioning, I think has been proved in several experiments, like the Jena or the Cedar Creek experiment and so on. But with the idea that the more niche differences and therefore the more complementarity effects, the higher is going to be the biodiversity. So sorry, the higher is going to be the effect of biodiversity on functioning, just because of the niche complementarity. Here we are saying it's not only important to have huge niche differences, it's also important to compare how these broad niche differences are related to the extent of how species are different in their ability to grow. So if you have large niche differences and species do alike in their performance, so if for instance you use water, I use nitrogen, and we will grow a lot, and we don't bother each other because we grow a lot to the same extent, then multifunctionality and functioning is ensured. If you use water and you do very well, and I use nitrogen and I do more or less okay, then biodiversity is not going to have an effect on functioning. So basically, is this idea. The distance to the edge, the farther you are from the exclusion point, means that the larger are your niche differences and you have similar strength of growth. And under these conditions is where not only functioning, but also multifunctionality is enhanced. That answer your question, or it brings new doubts? So yeah, okay.
I don't know if we have time for more questions. I don't know if there are more questions.
Thanks to you. Yeah, thank you again.